Just as a way of introduction, I am an art, craft and design teacher. I was acutely aware of the range of disciplines that is. Sometimes people say they're an art teacher, but there are three different industries. You could be in front of a Mac screen as a graphic designer, or you could be carving stone. They're very, very different. So very early on, I was kind of acutely aware that the three different disciplines would require three different teaching styles. That brought me into researching or studying the concept of difference, not just in what we're teaching, but also the students. In a roundabout way, that brought me into disability support. So what I do, a lot of what I do now is working to support students. So for today, I've asked, could I break the rules a little bit and not present on a learning style, but to present on something that might complement the learning style discussion. I thought it might be nice to show you a photograph of my classroom. So what I'm going to present on is Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. But before I get into Universal Design for Learning, just to give it some context, other things that I thought we could be talking about is theories. We could start looking at the learning theories that we've all studied to become teachers, in terms of the behaviourist theory, the cognitivist theory, or the humanist theory. So we could start breaking those theories apart. But for today, I just want to mention, we're not going to go into detail in terms, but just to give context, three terms that we use regularly, and three domains, three of your learning domains. And then I'll go in and explain what universal design means. I have no answers, obviously, but my aim of the presentation is just to raise questions, or to put questions in context for the next 2 years, in terms of when I'm thinking about the project, what I'm trying to understand in terms of what my role is and what your role is, and where it's going. So it's just seeing what type of questions we could be looking at. I'll start with the terminology. Three basic terms. Well, I won't say basic, but they're terms that in our sector we're using a lot. We're using them to name our centres. Can you guess where I'm going with this? No? Being too cryptic. Pedagogy. So terms that we use every day in our industry. I'm not going to go into it in detail, but just looking at the project and thinking, can we take something from it? If we do go back to the theory and see what we can take from it in relation to IT. Three basic questions that are the structure of my lesson plans. So my lesson plans, I suppose we all have a different structure to our lesson plans, but my lesson plans is a Word document. It has a table in it and there's different sections. But these are the questions that determine the structure of that lesson plan. What do my students need to know? What do they need to learn? How are they going to learn it? And then how am I going to evaluate whether they've actually learned it or not? The only addition to that I'm putting in today is just that extra question is, where does IT sit in our lesson plan document? So can we relate IT to those different sections? Okay, question 2 and 3 are fairly tangible. Am I speaking too quickly? I think I'm the first English-speaking presenter and I'll be the one that you can't understand. 2 and 3, we can see very easily how IT can fit into those. Number 1, maybe not so clear, because the learning objective can't be changed. And that brings other topics that I want to talk about later. The other 2, andragogy, and I love the word hootagogy, I feel like singing it. I'm not going to mention too much about andragogy, I don't have much to say about just the distinction between pedagogy, teaching children, and teaching adults. There is 5 presumptions. I don't sit very easily with those presumptions. I have children at home. If you're trying to tell me my 4-year-old is not independent, he's not listening to me. He must be listening to somebody else. But for hootagogy, I thought that did bring up an interesting question. And it's recognizing that our teaching environment has changed. So it's acknowledging the internet and the vast resource of data that's out there. And it's asking us to reevaluate our role as educators. My brother-in-law, he got an old bike. It was broken, didn't work, ready for the scrap heap. He took that bike apart into parts that you could hold in your hand and then reassembled it back into a perfectly working motorbike. There was no teacher involved. There was a learner and a data resource. So there was YouTube. So, and this kind of raises questions as to what we were talking about yesterday in terms of Facebook. We're looking at the role that we are taking and thinking of, okay, we are subject teachers, but we're also teaching students to become lifelong learners. So that idea of Facebook being a distraction, that they have the discipline outside to use that resource in a professional kind of logical way. So they're the 3 terms. I also just want to mention the 3 learning domains. Again, something that would be going into my lesson planning. So I just go through the 3 learning domains quite quickly. The first one, cognitive, the thinking domain. So there's 6 parts to it. You've got knowledge. Students need to learn content. Sometimes rote learning gets a bad reputation, but we were talking about it last night. Sometimes rote learning has a place to play as well. If, again, my children at home, if they had beautiful scripts like we saw yesterday with the numbers in the schools, there's an element of rote learning in that, because I've seen my child doing it, writing their letters over and over again. It does have a place, and there is there's a place for it in our planning. You've got comprehension. The student needs to understand what they're doing. They need to be able to grasp and construct meaning from what they're reading or from what they're looking at. They then have to be able to apply that, and I'm talking in terms of a practical place. The next 3 is analyze. They have to have the ability to analyze. With study support, I see this a lot. Students come to me for help, they're writing a report, and they have poor analysis ability. So they're reading material off the internet or a book, but they can't distinguish what is valuable for their report and what is not. So they have to learn the ability to analyze. They have to then, once they've deconstructed all this information that they've taken from the internet, they have to have the skill to put it all back together to create a product, which is a separate job entirely. And then at the end, they have to have the ability to evaluate. So that's not just evaluating their own work, but also evaluating the information that they're finding on the internet and see what is worth using and what is not using. So that's the cognitive domain. Why am I going into it? Because I'm wondering if the project could focus on each area and start analysing that, can IT work, or can IT specifically target each of those 6 areas in the cognitive domain? The next one is the affective domain. So this is the student's emotional response to the information they're getting. They're doing it in 3 ways. So the student has to be a willing recipient to the information that you're giving them. They also have to be willing to respond. That idea of taking part in class, they have to be willing to do that. And lastly, they have to be willing to value what you are teaching them. They have to think it's worthwhile remembering. And that is one thing that maybe is worth mentioning in terms of from andragogy. As teachers, when we go into the classroom, for adults at least, we have to convince those adults that we're worth listening to, that we have something to teach them. And the last one is the psychomotor domain. Now, I'm talking about this in a slightly different way than the learning styles. So this isn't a kinesthetic learning style, but this is a psychomotor learning domain. So we are looking at skills that is not cognitive based, they're not learning theory, but they're learning a physical skill of some kind. I mentioned earlier my 3 areas, art, craft and design. When you're working in or teaching art, craft and design, you could be teaching students that will end up in a career in front of an Apple Mac as graphic designers, or you could be teaching somebody that's going to end up carving stone. The carving the stone has a physical activity, but also the graphic designer, they're on a keyboard. That's a physical activity. But I'm not trying to teach the students to be better at typing. You're teaching them the skill of design. Does that make sense? Another example, but that is science students. If a science student was looking through a microscope and the learning objective of the class was so that they could identify biological cells, the fact that they're looking through the microscope is only an action, it's not the learning objective. They're not trying to get better at looking through the microscope. The theorists have very neatly, because they've nothing better to be doing, analysed all our different types of movements. Some of them I don't think are as relevant, but I've just highlighted 3 types of physical movement that I think, are being taught in our centres, our institutions. So you've got perceptual abilities, that ability to be able to take information from the environment and to respond to it. You've got skilled movement. So you've got the likes of performance art, dance, sport, but also the fine arts and crafts. And then the last one, you've got non-discursive movement. So that's movement communication through body language, as opposed to using verbal text. We're teaching all of these skills in all our centres. And again, why am I bringing it up? Is just looking at them and saying, can we look at each one in turn and then identify how could IT work? Another example of this actually is just YouTube. If you have a woodwork teacher in a classroom of 25 students and he's trying to show a little detail of maybe marquetry or something like this, he can't do the little detail in woodwork and keep an eye on all his 25 students at the same time. And all 25 students can't see the little detail fingerwork he's doing. So just the sheer act of putting it up onto a YouTube video, he can watch the students can watch the video, he can pause the video and ask questions and so forth. So it's just looking at the learning domains and seeing, can we retrofit IT into it in some form or fashion. Okay, so that's a repeat. Let me move on. I finally get there. Universal design for learning. It's not a theory, it's a set of guidelines for good practice. I'm saying it's relatively new, but it's actually not relatively new. It's just taking traction now. It has, for me at least, it is coming out of the disability support movement. A lot of times people don't associate students with disabilities as having a rights movement, but they do. It's a very quiet, polite movement, but it's there, and universal design is kind of spearheading that. I do a lot of training through St. John's with another organisation in Ireland called AHEAD. They explain universal design for learning a lot better than I can. If I could.
Imagine you went into a big clothes store, and all was on sale was one type of outfit, in one size, with no thought given to different individual body shapes or personalities. That would be crazy, right? Expecting everyone to be able to fit into the same size and express themselves in the same colour and style? Yet in many cases, that's exactly what is happening in our education system. When it comes to learning, variability is the rule, not the exception, and our college campuses are now grappling with the demands of an increasingly diverse cohort of learners, with increasing numbers of international students, students from different cultural and socio-economic backgrounds, mature students, and students with disabilities. Despite this, curriculums are still designed for the mythical average learner, and all are expected to engage and learn on the same terms. Not enough flexibility is built in at the design stage to give all students equal opportunities to learn in ways that play to their own strengths. So, how can our institutions respond to these challenges? Enter Universal Design for Learning, or UDL for short. UDL is an educational framework that guides the design of learning goals, materials, methods and assessments, as well as the policies surrounding these curricular elements with the diversity of learners in mind. The framework was developed by US organisation CAST and is based on research in the field of neuroscience. It promotes 3 core principles for educators to build into their teaching practice, calling on to provide students with multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. The framework includes a set of guidelines on how you can turn these principles into practice. For example, by fostering collaboration with the introduction of group work with clear goals, roles, and responsibilities. By using different types of media to support learning, and ensuring that all materials are accessible. And by providing a choice of assessment instruments while maintaining robust learning outcomes. You are probably already including some UDL elements in your practice without realising it, and there is much more to explore. So don't be afraid to let Universal Design for Learning give you a new lens through which to look at your teaching and learning practice and help you to better reach all of your students. For more information and resources,
It's Dara, he's from Dublin speaking. I think he speaks clearer than I am. He should be here. So we see universal design, it is looking at accommodating difference. And it is trying to look at more than just what type of visual aids we use in the classroom, or indeed what type of teaching methodologies that we use. But it's looking at the full scope of activity of what happens in our colleges, from the planning stage of what we want to teach. So that's making what we call in Ireland our component descriptors, the syllabus that you're teaching, designing that in a universal way, so it can be adaptable. We are looking at the material that we're using in class, so we're looking at the type of visual aids that we use, or the type of activities, so the teaching methods, but also it's looking at the assessments that we're using. So what universal design is saying, there's no point in universally designing all the other aspects of what we're doing in schools if we're not assessing the students in a way that is adaptable to their abilities. There's a quite nice TED talk. It's 18 minutes long, so I won't show it now. But Todd Rose is his name. He's an American, and there's one point at the start of it that I thought is quite interesting. He starts talking about American fighter jet planes, or the cockpit of fighter jet planes, and how they were employing people to fit these cockpits. So they had to hire somebody that actually fitted the cockpit that was designed for the average pilot. Whatever they were basing their success rates on, they weren't successful when they started doing research, and they measured their pilots. They found that not one employee matched what they considered the average cockpit. So, and this is where this is in the 50s, so this is where your adjustable car seats have come from. They kind of just watered it down to commercial use. But what Todd is saying is he adapts that logic into our teaching. Now, obviously not for physicality, but for learning styles, for abilities of vocabulary. And he's saying, let's ban the average. That we can't have, and what I kind of think of in terms of average is the lecturing approach. So the teacher up at the classroom, it's note-based, it's not achieving multiple learning styles and so forth. So they're banning the average, and they're saying we have to plan our education to the extreme. So as the students with high vocabulary and low vocabulary can achieve the learning outcome. That's provided the learning outcome isn't vocabulary based. That these can be barriers that will stop the person from achieving the learning outcome, and that we should try our best to get rid of those if we can. As the video said, there's 3 principles and there's 9 strategies. I'm a visual learner. I don't think logically. The principles should come first, but I'm having a look at the strategies. So our institutions, or our education system, should be equitable of use. And that means all students, regardless of ability or learning style, should have the same opportunities as others of achieving the learning goals. So that's using notes without alternative formats. Alternative formats would be, in the past, students with dyslexia might have gotten separate printouts on yellow paper. So it's eliminating those kind of areas and allowing engagement based, again, on multiple learning styles. Our education system should be flexible to use. So we should have a variety of flexibility and a diversity in teaching materials. A lot of what has already been said this morning and yesterday, but no over-reliance on the traditional lecture model. We're saying to use discussions and group work and interactive, but as I kind of made a point there at the end, the assessment. I find when I go to conferences or training sessions on UDL, a lot of the case studies are based around the activities in the class. Nobody seems to be tackling the assessment yet, because the assessment is written in the syllabus. It's a little bit trickier, and maybe people are afraid to alter the assessment or to mess with the assessment, but the assessment needs to be looked at as well and designed to be flexible. So what do I mean by that? If we give a student an assignment, the traditional response from the teacher is to ask for a written report. We do a lot of written reports. But the learning objective may not be to learn how to write or how to structure a report. So they're just add-ons to the learning objective. The student could prove that they've achieved the learning by doing a presentation, by submitting a video, or drawing a comic. So it's just allowing the students the freedom to express themselves or to express their learning of the outcome in a flexible way. Now again, our descriptors or your syllabus probably states that this is possible. Ours does. A lot of our descriptors will say to write a report, but you can also submit a video and so forth. But I just find that it's an afterthought, and it doesn't help the teacher to actually achieve it. It's easier to accept a written report from a student as opposed to being flexible and accepting multiple ranges. And I suppose this project could look at ways of supporting the teachers and putting strategies and tools in place that will make accepting a video or a comic just as easy as accepting a written report. Another example, we do a lot of skills demonstrations. Skills demonstrations is, especially for psychomotor domain, the hairdressers are demonstrating that they've learned a skill. It's done under a set environment, so there's a set time, there's an invigilator or an inspector in the room with a ticking off boxes over the student's shoulder. The student is asked to prove that they can cut hair. They're not asked to prove that they can cut hair under stress. So if we can eliminate the stress, and people will respond to this differently because it is assessment based, but it's just throwing ideas out there. A skills demonstration, they all have phones. They could record their skills demonstration, they could practice it multiple times and pick their best and submit that at a time that suits them and is proving that they've achieved the learning goal.
I find it really beneficial when lecturers break up the class structure, and I do a lot of classes where we have the first hour is sitting, listening, reading for the board, whatever it may be, and the second half of the class is actually going out and doing what you've just learned, whether it's shooting footage or recording audio or whatever it might be. And at the same time, then it's great when lecturers give you the option to deliver your assignments in a different way. And I struggle with essays quite a bit. I struggle to get my point across, I just repeat all the time. And when I pride myself on my presentation skills and just being able to stand up and speak in the room, it's really great lecturers give you the option to be able to choose what delivery suits you best so you can get the best result.
Strategy number 3, keeping it simple and keeping it intuitive. So students, especially in terms of the content of what we're teaching in class, but also in terms of assignments. So for exams or assessments, so that they know not just what's being examined, but also how it's going to be examined, and actually give them training or teaching in doing exams. It could be as simple as understanding the type of terms that they're going to see in an exam. A lot of students that come to me for support have trouble understanding the difference between words like outline, explain, or define. So it's just giving them those core skills to make the exam easier for them to do. Number 4, perceptible information. I think when people think about disability, this is the first thing we think about, is making the content that we give out accessible. So we're talking about a certain type of font being used, maybe a minimum size font for printed material or a minimum size font for PowerPoints. I think if we could just give them their notes electronically, it doesn't matter what font it is in or what size it's in. If it's in there electronically, they have the ability to adapt it to whatever suits them. If it's not text-based, they can listen to it. But the key point is that they have access to it, accessible. The other thing that I was going to mention today is just in terms of the IT that we already have. That looking at what we have and thinking about, rather than bringing in extra IT, because a lot of the students that I have are struggling already, rather than putting extra IT in on top of them, looking at what they are already using and saying how can we use that to help boost up their academic skills. One of those, for me, I try and keep some in terms of apps and IT down to a minimum as I can. We had to invest in something, and one of them that I've invested my time in is in Read and Write Gold. For that, why I use that is it matches the universal design in a very clear way. Students can listen to their class notes read out to them. Students can take, if they're handed paper-based notes in class, they can photograph it and convert those notes into Word documents. They can take those Word documents and convert them into audio files, so as they can listen to their notes, going home on the train and so forth. So it's meeting the criteria of universal design quite well. Number 4, we should be with a high tolerance of error. This is talking about executive functioning skills or academic skills. We work in further education, and sometimes there can be a presumption that the students have learned to be a student in primary school and secondary school. But sometimes their ability or their skills at being a student may not be that strong. So we look at how can we use IT, if it suits the student, to help them with their time management, to help them with their study planning, to help them with their writing, and even to help them with their research. Low physical effort. This is where it would have been hypocritical of me to ask you with the translation. Low physical effort, if a student is kinesthetic and they like to write to keep their attention in class, that's good. But if a student has dyslexia and they're not supplied with notes for the class, the fact that they're having to take notes is a physical effort for them. If we ask them to use IT that is so flashy, they love it, and their attention is on the IT as opposed to the learning objective, or it's too tricky for them, their attention then is on the IT as opposed to the learning objective. So it's eliminating all those barriers to learning. Again, looking at what we already have, or what the students are already using, and maybe saying, you can use this in a different way. So you could use Word to do a brainstorm. You don't have to go out into an extra app to do a mind map or a brainstorm. Just teaching them to double click anywhere on the page and they can type wherever it comes up. Or teaching them that their Word program will actually read out their assignments to them once they've typed it up, so as they can listen to it and see if it makes sense. But it's just using what the student already has and teaching them skills for it. The size and space is talking about how we use our classrooms. So the classroom management. Again, it's breaking away from that traditional role of what I'm doing up here, text-based, me speaking, and the students not engaging. Building a community of learners. If we're looking at the theories, the humanist theory is recognizing that students are learning as a social group, as well as, we have learning styles that within that group, but they're a social group. This is where we start talking about, isn't last year's group stronger or weaker than this year's group? That they feed off each other in ways. So we're looking at peer mentoring, creating study groups, online discussion boards, and collaborative online learning environments. Using what they already have. Most of our students have Google. So obviously Google Docs can be used for collaboration, but I also use Google Docs because they already have it for planning skills. So we have a Word document, and it tracks all the tasks that the student has to do for all of their subjects in one document. But the student isn't doing it independently. The whole class are feeding into the one document. So no one student then gets left behind or forgets an assignment or misinterprets an assignment. The last one is the instructional climate. Not as relevant, I think, to our discussion this week. The one thing I would mention about it's the idea of making students feel welcome in the classroom. But they do talk about having a strategy, an inclusivity strategy or a statement. The universal design is saying that statement should be wrote for each subject. that it should not just be in the handbook at the start of the year, that it forms the first discussion of the class. It's not just about saying we are going to be inclusive, but it's talking about the subject. What is the end goal that we are trying to do here? What are the learning objectives? And talking with the students as to how do you want to get to there? So we are at A, we need to be at B, and how do you want to get there? What's going to suit you? I'm nearly there. There's 3 principles. As you see, each one of these lines of text is a link, and each link is an article in itself. So it's quite heavy. I'm not going to try and go into it. But this is from CAST. It's an American organization. It's cast.org. And I've given you the link as well in the translation document. But it's a lovely website, and it just goes through it in, as you see, a lot of detail. Some of the things worth pointing out are summarizing. So our teaching needs to be customizable. We need to illustrate concepts through multiple media. I think one thing that we work on is if your key point or your learning objective, sometimes you might illustrate one key point visually and another key point in text. But what Universal Design is saying is that one key point should be represented in all the learning styles. So each individual point or each individual item that the student needs to be learned is represented in a range of ways. Our teaching should be clear, and this is where IT comes in very tangibly, activating and backing up knowledge. How do students act and express their learning? So we should be giving them multiple means of communication. That's online or interactive web tools. We should be building their influences. Instead of the word influences there, I should have learning styles. I mentioned at the start, I'm a visual learner. I have an uneasy relationship with that, because if you asked me when I was 12, what did I want to be when I grew up, I'd have said an artist. So if you asked me what learning style I am, I would have said at a very early age, I'm a visual learner. But I'm thinking, what age was I when I gave up trying to think mathematically? Or what age was I when I thought, I'm not a logical thinker, I'm a creative teacher? Because after all, that's what I want to be. So what we're saying in Universal Design is take the learning style that the student has, but also work on their other academic skills, or their other learning styles.